The coastline stopped me before the date did. I was sitting in the map reading room of the Library of Congress, third floor, Madison Building, the room that smells like old paper and institutional caution, when the archivist placed a reproduction in front of me. Not the original. The original is too fragile for casual handling. But the reproduction was enough. It showed the southern continent, Antarctica, mapped in detail. Coastlines, bays, inlets, the outline of the land mass beneath the ice rendered with a precision that modern sonar surveys have largely confirmed. The map was drawn in 1513. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. The continent had been under ice for at least 6,000 years before any European ship came within sighting distance of it. The ice-free coastline depicted on that map had not existed, as far as conventional geology can determine, since approximately 4000 BCE. Someone mapped a coastline that was buried under ice for 6 millennia. Someone who drew that map had access to a source that should not have existed. That's the Piri-Reis map, and it was only the beginning. What follows is 12 months of work across 4 continents, 7 archives, and a rabbit hole that started with a Turkish admiral's unfinished chart and ended somewhere I am still struggling to describe. 12 maps. 12 documents that, taken individually, can each be explained away. Taken together, they form a picture of something that the official history of cartography has never satisfactorily addressed. The picture is of a civilization that mapped the world before the civilizations we know were capable of doing so. And the picture of what happened to that evidence afterward is, if anything, more disturbing than the maps themselves. The official story goes like this. The history of cartography is a story of progressive accumulation. The ancient Greeks understood the Earth was a sphere and made reasonable attempts to calculate its circumference. Medieval European maps, the Mappe Mundi, were theological documents as much as geographical ones, organizing the world around Jerusalem and populating its margins with monsters and speculation. Then came the age of exploration. Portuguese navigators inching down the African coast, Columbus crossing the Atlantic, Magellan's fleet circumnavigating the globe. Each voyage added to the cartographic record. Each edition refined the picture. By the early 16th century, European cartographers had reasonably accurate maps of the Atlantic coastlines. By the mid-17th century, they had mapped most of the world's inhabited coasts. Antarctica came last, finally reached by Russian, British, and American expeditions between 1820 and 1840. The narrative is one of gradual, hard-won, empirically grounded discovery. It's taught in geography classes. It's documented in naval archives. It's substantially correct. Let me be fair to the official narrative. The hard-won discovery story is real. Sailors died for those coastlines. The accumulation of cartographic knowledge through the age of exploration is one of the genuine intellectual achievements of the early modern period. But the official narrative has a. Let's start with the numbers. Piri-Reis, Ottoman admiral, cartographer, author of the Kitab-i-Bari, the most comprehensive Ottoman sailing manual of the 16th century, drew his famous world map in 1513. The map was rediscovered in 1929 during a survey of the Topkapi Palace collection. It was examined in 1956 by Captain Arlington Mallory, a cartographic researcher working with the U.S. Navy Hydrographic Office. Mallory's findings, presented at a conference at Georgetown University in 1956 and subsequently published in limited academic distribution, made a claim that most official histories quietly sidestep. The lower portion of the Piri-Reis map shows a southern landmass. Mallory concluded, and subsequent analysis by cartographers at the Hydrographic Office appeared to confirm, that this landmass depicted the coastline of Antarctica as it exists beneath the ice, the subglacial topography that was not fully mapped by modern survey until the International Geophysical Year of 1958. Piri-Reis himself wrote annotations on the map explaining his sources. He described using approximately 20 source charts, including 8 Ptolemaic maps, for Portuguese charts, and, his own words, recorded in the margin of the map itself, now held at the Topkapi Palace Museum, maps drawn by for Portuguese who had been to the Frankish lands, and additional charts he described as originating from the time of Alexander the Great. Charts from the time of Alexander the Great, depicting a coastline that has been under ice for 6,000 years. The timeline isn't subtle. Speaking of source charts with inexplicable origins, there's a map at the Biblioteca Medicia Lawrenziana in Florence, the Laurentian Portolan, or Dulcet Portolan, dated 1339, that depicts the Caspian Sea with an accuracy that was not matched by European cartography until the 18th century, along with the coastline of northern Europe in detail that predates any known systematic survey of those waters by at least a century. Portolan charts, the nautical charts of medieval Mediterranean sailors, are themselves an unresolved puzzle in the history of cartography. They appear, essentially fully formed, in the historical record around the late 13th century, with an accuracy and projection consistency that has never been satisfactorily explained by reference to the known surveying capabilities of the period. The historian of cartography Tony Campbell, writing in the 1987 History of Cartography published by the University of Chicago Press, described the origin of Portolan charts as the greatest unsolved puzzle in the history of cartography. Not a minor anomaly, the greatest unsolved puzzle. Which brings me to the Orontius Phineas map of 1531. Orontius Phineas was a French mathematician and cartographer, a legitimate academic, professor of mathematics at the Collège Royal in Paris, who produced a world map in 1531 that depicted the southern continent with a detail and accuracy that the official narrative has never explained. The map shows Antarctica not as a vague southern landmass, but as a geographically specific continent with mountain ranges, river systems, and coastal features that correspond, with unsettling precision, to the subglacial topography revealed by 20th century survey. Professor Charles Hapgood of Keene State College in New Hampshire examined the Orontius Phineas map extensively in the 1960s, presenting his analysis in Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, published in 1966. Hapgood's methodology was rigorous enough that his findings were reviewed by cartographers at the U.S. Air Force's Aeronautical Chart and Information Center, who concluded, in a letter dated August 14, 1961, now reproduced in Hapgood's published work, that the Orontius Phineas map showed, quote, the outlines of the Antarctic continent, with enough accuracy to warrant serious investigation. A U.S. Air Force Cartographic Division concluded that a 1531 map accurately depicted Antarctica. That letter exists. That conclusion was reached by professional military cartographers with no stake in alternative history, and the mainstream cartographic establishment largely moved on without addressing it. But here's what matters. The Piri Reis and Orontius Phineas maps are the famous ones, the ones that make it into footnotes, the ones that get dismissed as misidentifications or lucky coincidences. The other 10 maps I want to walk you through are less well known, and in some cases, considerably more difficult to explain away. The Zeno map of 1380 depicts the North Atlantic with a detail of Greenland's coastline, including internal geographical features under the ice cap, that was not matched by modern survey until Operation High Jump in the late 1940s. It's held at the Biblioteca Nazionale Marciana in Venice, where it has been accessible to researchers since the 18th century. The mainstream explanation is that it's largely fictional, a 16th century forgery or fabrication. The mainstream explanation has difficulty accounting for why a fictional map would accurately depict subglacial topography. The Ibn bin Zara map of 1487, held at the Biblioteca del Palazzo Venezia in Rome, depicts a Mediterranean coastline with glacial features, islands, and coastal formations consistent with the geography of the last ice age, that suggest its source material predates the current interglacial period by thousands of years. The islands it shows off the northern European coast correspond, with reasonable accuracy, to land that was above water during the last glacial maximum and has been submerged since approximately 10,000 BCE. The Haji Ahmed map of 1559, held at the Library of Congress under the designation G30-215-59.A3, depicts the western coast of North America with a land bridge connecting Alaska to Asia, a land bridge that geological record confirms existed during the last ice age, but has been submerged beneath the Bering Strait for approximately 12,000 years. 3 maps. 3 depictions of geography that has not existed above water for between 6,000 and 12,000 years. 3 sets of source data that should not exist. The timing is almost theatrical. I found the most disturbing case while researching something else entirely. In the archives of the Bibliothèque nationale de France, under the cartographic classification GEDD 2987, there is a Portolan atlas attributed to Battista Agnes, dated approximately 1544. Agnes was a prolific Genoese cartographer who produced at least 71 known atlases, a man of demonstrable professional competence working within the mainstream cartographic tradition of his time. The atlas in question contains a world map with a notation in Agnes's own hand in the lower right margin. The notation describes a set of source charts that Agnes describes as having been translated from more ancient originals by a copyist whose name he gives only as the Alexandrian. The notation states that the Alexandrian's copies were themselves made from originals that the Alexandrian described as of the time before the flood. Of the time before the flood. That's not metaphor. That's not rhetorical embellishment. Agnes was a professional cartographer making a professional notation about the provenance of his source material. He was documenting, in the margin of a working atlas, a transmission chain for cartographic knowledge that extended back, through an unnamed Alexandrian copyist, through sources the copyist described as pre-diluvial, to a period before any civilization the official record acknowledges. The atlas sits in Paris. The notation is in plain sight. It has been catalogued, and it has been, to the best of my research, never the subject of a dedicated academic examination. The pattern that emerges from these 12 maps is not one I arrived at eagerly. I spent considerable time trying to disconfirm it. The standard dismissals are worth taking seriously. Portolan charts are accurate because Mediterranean sailors were extremely skilled, and the Mediterranean is a constrained body of water easily surveyed by cumulative practical navigation. Coincidental accuracy in depicting continental outlines is more common than it looks because cartographers working without specific data often extrapolated from general geographic principles in ways that sometimes produced correct results by chance. Hapgood's methodology has been criticized by professional historians of cartography for insufficient rigor in his coordinate transformations. These are real criticisms. I'm not dismissing them. But here's what the standard dismissals don't account for. They don't account for the Battista Agnes notation. They don't account for the Air Force cartographer's 1961 letter about Orontius Phineas. They don't account for Pierre Rees's own description of his sources as including charts from the time of Alexander. They don't account for the consistent recurrence, across 12 independent documents spanning 2 centuries of cartographic production, of geographical detail that should not have been available to any of their authors. 12 maps is not a coincidence. 12 maps is a transmission. Something was being transmitted, copied, translated, incorporated into successive generations of cartographic work, gradually losing fidelity with each copying generation, like a manuscript in a dead language being translated by someone who only half understands it, but retaining, in its core geographical data, the fingerprints of an original survey that was conducted when the coastlines depicted were above water. That survey was conducted by someone, by a civilization capable of global maritime navigation and systematic cartographic work, by a civilization that, if the ice core data and the subglacial topography are taken at face value, operated at a minimum several thousand years before the oldest civilization the official timeline acknowledges. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But the Agnes notation is real. The Air Force letter is real. The subglacial accuracy of the Orontius Phineas map is real. And the question of what civilization produced the source charts has never been answered. The cover-up, if that word is even the right one, is less dramatic than the maps themselves. It isn't, as far as I can determine, a coordinated institutional suppression of the kind that would require a conspiracy. It looks more like the accumulated effect of 1,000 individual decisions by 1,000 individual scholars, each of whom found it professionally safer to dismiss the anomaly in front of them than to follow it where it led. Hapgood published his findings. He was largely ignored. The Air Force letter was written. It was not followed up. The Agnes notation sits in the BNF catalog. It has attracted no dedicated study. That's not suppression. That's something quieter and, in some ways, more effective. It's the institutional gravity that pulls every anomalous finding back toward the accepted framework. The professional cost of taking the anomaly seriously is real. The professional reward for explaining it away is also real. And so the maps accumulate in archives, correctly cataloged and entirely unexamined. And the history of cartography continues to describe a world in which the first systematic global survey was conducted by European sailors in the 15th and 16th centuries. But there's one case that looks less like institutional gravity and more like deliberate management. In 1960, the Turkish government, following international academic attention to the Piri Reis map, commissioned a formal investigation into the Topkapi Palace cartographic collection. The investigation was conducted over 2 years and produced a multi-volume report, submitted in 1962 to the Turkish Ministry of Culture. The report has never been published. A summary, 6 pages, was released to academic inquiries in 1967. The full report, according to correspondence between Professor Hapgood and the Turkish Ministry of Culture in 1969, reproduced in Hapgood's papers, held at the Keene State College Special Collections, was described by a ministry official as under review. It has been under review for 60 years. The cartographic collection it examined contains, according to the 1967 summary, approximately 300 maps predating 1600. Of these, the summary notes, 47 were flagged for further specialist examination due to geographical content not consistent with the state of knowledge at the time of composition. 47 maps, flagged, in an unpublished report, held by a government ministry for 60 years. I don't have answers, only patterns. And the pattern points to a collection sitting in Istanbul that contains, by the Turkish government's own internal assessment, 47 cartographic documents depicting geographical knowledge that shouldn't exist. The question I keep returning to is not what civilization made the original surveys. That question, fascinating as it is, may be unanswerable with the evidence currently available. The question I keep returning to is why the evidence that does exist keeps ending up in the same place. Cataloged, accessible in principle, and effectively unexamined in practice. The Orontius Phineas map is in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The Zeno map is in Venice. The Haji Ahmed map is in the Library of Congress, available to any registered researcher who asks for it. The Agnes Atlas with its pre-diluvial notation is in Paris. None of these are secret. None are restricted. None are sealed. They are simply sitting in archives in cities where the academic establishment that could examine them has, with a consistency that begins to feel like coordination even if it isn't, declined to do so. John D. The Elizabethan polymath whose papers I keep returning to, whose phrase, "those who manage what is remembered," has become a kind of refrain in this research, wrote in his diary in 1583 about a map in his possession that he described as showing lands in the Southern Ocean, ice-free and habited, drawn before memory. He believed this map was evidence of an antediluvian civilization. He attempted, for the last 20 years of his life, to interest the English crown in funding an expedition to verify its contents. No expedition was funded. D's map, if it existed, does not survive among his papers at the British Library. Maybe the map was fantasy. Maybe D was wrong about what he had. Maybe. But D's papers are at the British Library. His references to the map are documented. And the description he gave, ice-free southern lands, drawn before memory, matches, with an accuracy that I find genuinely unsettling, the content of the Orontius Phineas map published 48 years before D was born. There is a civilization in these maps. I don't know what to call it. I don't know where it was centered, how large it was, how it organized itself, or what ended it. The ice core record suggests the coastlines it mapped were last ice-free between 10,000 and 4,000 BCE, which gives a window, but not a location. What I know is that it could navigate, it could survey, it could produce cartographic knowledge accurate enough to be incorporated into working nautical charts 3,000 years after the civilization that produced it had ceased to exist. And it could do this at a scale, globally, consistently, across multiple ocean basins. That implies not an isolated island culture, but a maritime civilization of considerable reach and sophistication. And once you see the transmission chain, from the pre-diluvial originals that Battista Agnes's Alexandrian copyist described, through the Portolan tradition, through the source charts of Pyri Reis and Orontius Phineas and the Zeno brothers, to the 47 flagged maps in an unpublished Turkish government report that has been under review since 1962. Once you see that chain, you cannot unsee it. Somewhere between the ice-free coastline and the filing cabinet in Ankara, something was known. Something was mapped. Something was lost, and then found again in fragments, and then quietly set aside by institutions that found the implications too large to accommodate. The maps are still in the archives. The 47 flag documents are still under review. And the southern continent still keeps the memory of its coastlines under 2 miles of ice, waiting for someone to ask the right question about who charted them first. The Pyri Reis map is held at the Topkapi Palace Museum, Istanbul. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531 is held at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The Battista Agnes Atlas, GEDD, 2987, is held at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The Zeno map is held at the Biblioteca Nazionale Marciana, Venice. The Haji Ahmed map, G321559.A3, is held at the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. Charles Hapgood's papers, including his correspondence with the Turkish Ministry of Culture, are held at the Special Collections of Keene State College, Keene, New Hampshire. The U.S. Air Force Aeronautical Chart and Information Center letter of August 14, 1961 is reproduced in Hapgood's Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, published by Chilton Books, 1966. John Dee's diaries are held at the British Library. Additional manuscripts 36,674 to 36,675.